What's up guys, today you're gonna learn the most important positional concept in chess, and you will see how the single idea determines everything that you do in the middle game. It's a whole positional masterclass. Alright, let's dive in. White player is Positional, the black player is Donner, both of them are Grandmasters, and so far we're entering the still hand defense, the knight operation played by Kasparov, Fischer, and whatnot. Bishop c4, so far so good, both sides develop pieces. Bishop b3 is more of a prophylactic move so that black cannot attack it easily, and black indeed plays b5 to expand on the queen side and to potentially develop a bishop right there. f4. White starts to be aggressive in the middle of the board, preparing one of central advancements, and on the next turn he indeed plays f5, attacking this pawn. Why does he really want that? Well, he wants this pawn to either trade off or to be gone. Trading off is only good for white because that would only help white advance his knight. And after e5, looks like it's good for black because it kicks the knight back. However, there are certain positional drawbacks. And let's actually talk about this position, because similar ideas will apply to any game that you play and will give you clarity on how strong players plan, what it's all about, these pawn structures, weak squares, strong squares, open files, and whatnot. You'll see how to get it right. Okay, so first off, in order to define your plan, you need to look at the position in the middle of the board, because that situation is usually the most important. That is just the most important area of the board. Now, what do we see here? What we've got here is, okay, we have two identical pawns, nothing special there. We also have this really nice juicy square for our pieces, known as a strong square for you or a weak square for your opponent. Now, why is this so important? It's a long-term asset that you have, because moving forward throughout the rest of the game, you can land your piece there and begin your attack. Think about it this way. Look at the opponent's side of the board. What is the square where you can put your piece into safely? Onto opponent's side of the board. Really, think about this for a second. There aren't that many, right? Because his side of the board is covered by his pieces. Okay, maybe you can bring the bishop right here, but black can easily kick it out. Therefore, it's not really long term. Therefore, this hole on d5 is literally the only square that you can occupy. And it's like putting your foot in the door of your opponent's position, and from there you can expand your attack. But without this square, you cannot even begin your attack. That's why it's so critical. And I'm not saying you're going to play this move straight away because your opponent can trade it off, but I'm saying long term, it's going to be the way for you to begin your attack. That is why it's so important. All right, what else do we see here? We can also see this weak pawn on d6. All right, and what's good for you here? Well, you can put pressure and attack this pawn long term. Right now with your queen, down the line perhaps with your rook once you bring it there, and it's good for you. While for your opponent, it's the opposite. It's just a weakness. Why is it bad for him? Well, first off, he has to keep some pieces just to defend it, meaning he can't use them for more active purposes. And secondly, his own pawn restricts his pieces. The bishop cannot get out. He cannot get here or here where it would wish to be because of his own pawn, and he got stuck behind it. That is how having those backward pawns is bad for him. Which gives you one more reason to keep the situation as it is. You want the pawn to stay there, maybe even to blockade it, so that you totally lock not only this pawn, but all his pieces that stand behind it. And that is your long-term plan. To put pressure down this file, attack this pawn, to put your piece to this strong square, and if you can do that successfully, you're going to have significant positional advantage. What would your opponent try to do? Well, he'll try to oppose that. And in the ideal world, he'd wish to at some point play d5 and trade off this pawn so that he can get rid of his main problem and open up those files and diagonals for his pieces. Alright, now let's see how it played out in the real game. Black played knight to d7. By the way, you may have a question, what if black tries to snatch this pawn in the middle of the board? Well, he could do this, but he would fall behind in development, which is typically dangerous, because in an opening you need to develop. And here white can play bishop e3, knight g3, castle, stuff like that, maybe bishop d5 at some point, just trying to attack and use his advantage in development. For example, bishop f5 would already open up this file, and on top of that, queen d5 would be another move that wins the game on the spot with this double attack. Otherwise, if black just does nothing special, then white will simply keep gaining temples, attacking the bishop, will go forward, keep attacking, and black is done. White can also add his knight into the attack, threatening the same g7 pawn, and if it ever moves forward, you don't even need the rook because you can just go for this trade, and then sudden queen takes g6, little trick, taking advantage of the pin. Of course, black could play some other moves, but basically it just goes to show that falling behind in development is very dangerous. In the game, black played a much better move, knight to d7, just to develop, and white played bishop g5. pinning the knight. But you see that the point is not even the pin, because black can very easily get his queen out of this pin somehow. The point is white wants to take aim at this knight, who's one of the key defenders of that vital square d5, so that in the future, potentially, white can eliminate that defender. Black goes bishop e7, knight g3, and now knight to c5. And it's very interesting how this good-looking move that seems to put pressure all around, in fact, is a big positional mistake. Why is that so? Because it forgets about that main component of the position. Remember, white was going to occupy this weak square d5, and this knight from d7 was helping black to support the other knight, or the knight could go there and control the square. But now the knight goes off track, which allows white to take advantage of this weakness right away. White eliminates one of those defenders of the weak square d5, and then he places bishop to d5 to eliminate the second defender. Really cool for white. By the way, one more idea, in general, not only for this position, for any similar positions. Which piece do you want to put on a strong square? Is it a bishop or a knight? Or a queen maybe? Well, you can't put the queen typically that easily because, the square is too exposed. Your opponent will attack it with his minor pieces. Alright, so let's take the queen away. Now, is it a bishop or a knight? A bishop is a long-range piece, and it can be active from distance. But your knight does not attack your opponent anyhow while standing on the third rank. Therefore, you do want to bring your knight forward, and that is why an ideal piece to be fixed on d5 is your knight. But if so, why don't you move the knight right away? Well, then your opponent can trade it off. That's the problem. That is why white decided to first eliminate the defender of the weak square, so that he can get to this ideal outcome after the exchange. Now we've got this eternal knight on d5, and there is nothing black can do against it. There are no pawns on adjacent files that could possibly go forward and attack the knight. There are also no pieces that black can use to trade it off, and therefore now we've got this monstrous octopus knight that controls all these squares around, supporting white's either defense or attack, and it's a long-term problem for black. You see how hard it is for black to move around just because of your octopus knight. Anyway, now the knight is putting pressure here, black decided to play bishop h4, trying to pin the knight and maybe get this pawn on e4. White played queen f3 to solidify and overprotect, and after black castled, white decided to castle queenside, kind of saying, you know what, if you want to trade on g3, go ahead. Now it's really bad for black to do that, and he didn't, because in that case, white would open up the h-file, and after a couple of moves, probably black would be in big trouble because of his weakness of his king. Therefore, he didn't play that move. He instead played rook c8. How would he play here as white? That is also a very instructive moment. The move king b1 is not forced in any way. There is no danger to the king, but it's like a rule of thumb in chess. Whenever there is opponent's rook opposite to your king, it is usually better to get your king out of this file. It's a prophylactic move, and somehow in most of the game, most of the time, it comes out to be true, that it's better to get your king out of the way, so that in the long run, there are no issues there. Alright, black played knight d7, probably trying to challenge white's centralized knight on d5, and white decided, you know what, I want to keep my knight there anyways. He played knight to f1, another brilliant move, preparing to reroute this knight to e3, so that if black continues with his plan, knight b6, trying to trade off this active knight, white says, no problem, I've got a spare knight, knight e3. And after the trade, white would keep this ideal situation. Now there's literally no piece of black that could ever be used to trade off this knight. There's no light square bishop, no knights. The dark square bishop cannot attack a light square, and that is already a strategically winning position. In the actual game, black played a better move. He realized that white wants to put his knight to e3 to support the other one, and he went bishop g5, controlling this square. Say, okay, if you want to move your knight there, great, I'm going to trade it off straight away. And that's why white didn't play that move. He instead played pawn h4, challenging this bishop, and then the knight cannot still go there because it will be traded off. Therefore, white decided to reroute it to g4 to pressure this bishop, kind of looking for ways to also open up the king side and attack there. He already has big advantage in the middle of the board, and now he tries to create that second weakness to spread black's defense. Black did play knight b6, anyway trying to get rid of this annoying knight, but now knight g4 puts pressure here, and after the trade on d5, white managed to save his outpost on d5. By the way, notice that in such cases, it would be a big, terrible positional blunder for white to recapture not with a piece, but with a pawn. At first looks like, what's such a big difference, but in reality, recapturing with a pawn really solves almost all the problems of black. First off, there is no strong square on d5 for white's pieces anymore because this square is occupied by his own pawn. Secondly, the pawn on d6 is no longer weak. The file is blocked and white cannot put pressure to that pawn. It is actually quite the opposite. Now black's got this passed pawn on the e-file, and in the long run, it's going to be their asset. That's how easily white can spoil all their advantage with one seemingly simple recapture. In the actual game, Polugayevsky made a correct choice. Rook takes d5, holding on to this strong square, and moreover, on the next turn, black played f6, perhaps stopping white from this move. White now can play queen d3, and now he can stack his heavy pieces along the d-file, putting more and more pressure. Rook d1, now all of white's pieces are attacking this weakness, and now black is suffering. Black nevertheless found a creative defense, queen a8. Now, what's the purpose of that move? Well, black realized that he can't defend this pawn anymore, and therefore he used some X-ray defense, so to say. Now, if white tries to win the pawn right here, looks good for a second, but this queen from a8 strikes back, and now it comes with a bunch of counterattacks, and the position becomes complicated. In the actual game, white decided to avoid that, and he used another idea, also worth remembering. He played pawn a3, and I give it an exclamation mark because that's another rule of thumb. Whenever there is a situation where you have some free time, so to say, you don't need to defend from any specific threats, it makes sense to provide that loot for your king, so that down the line there is never a risk of any back rank checkmates to your king. And therefore white played this great move a3, providing an escape square just in case, because down the line usually it is useful sooner or later. Black played rook d8 to protect his weakness. And now there was one more instructive situation. Again, as I've told you, this whole game is basically a positional masterclass, showcasing all the positional ideas that you need to know. What do you do when you're trying to attack, but your opponent defends successfully? You need the second weakness. That's how you spread his defense too thin. And in this case, white decided to finally capitalize on this idea of disrupting pawns on the king side, so that after that he can start attacking them. And black already is in trouble. He made his best defending this pawn on d6, but now his pieces are too far away from the king side, and the pawn on h6 cannot be defended. King g7 cannot help. He didn't play that move because in this case white can, for example, reroute the rook right here, pushing the king away, and then the queen will anyway capture the pawn, therefore it only helps white. And instead black played here, instead of king to g7, he just played queen b7, trying to at least bring his queen back to defense of the king side. Here's the next question. Should white trade queens or not? What do you think? In general, the rule states that if you want to attack, if your opponent's king is weak, you should avoid exchanges of queens, because your queen is the main attacking piece. In most of the cases, you deliver a checkmate exactly by your queen. That is why you want to save it. And in this case also, there's another helpful idea. Whenever you are considering an exchange of two pieces, check which one is more active, which one is attacking, which one is defending. Here clearly your queen is putting pressure, it attacks, while the queen on g7 is just a defender. Therefore, certainly you don't want to trade queens, and if white would play queen takes g7, that would be quite a big positional blunder for white. By the way, if you want to feel comfortable in endgames, because I know that very often you feel unsure what to do in these kind of positions, I've got a free masterclass about that. I'll drop the link down below, you can check it out later. For now, let's stick to the game. White played queen e3, the correct move, avoiding exchange of queens. Black played queen g4, trying to perhaps attack some pawns right here, but it doesn't really do that much. g3, just holding on to this pawn. After rook d7, white goes rook to d3, improving the rook position and potentially getting ready to stack heavy pieces along the d-file. And after king f7, black is maybe trying to guard this weakness, but now white once again uses that idea of two weaknesses. Now the pawn on h7 is hanging, queen g7. Still the same thing. Should we trade queens or not? Definitely not, for all the same reasons. We want to keep attacking. Queen h5 check, putting the king back, and now king e7. Black rerouted the king to protect this weakness, but now after queen d1, white still puts his full pressure to this pawn on d6, and with using all these maneuvers on the king side, he managed to get rid of black's queen from g4. The queen used to stand there, but another rule states that whenever there is opponent's piece on your side of the board, it's usually better to get rid of it. And now white is absolutely clear, there are no pieces on his side of the board, he's totally secure, and he can keep increasing his pressure. Black still played queen h6, trying to put his queen to a more active position, and white goes b3. His heavy pieces are already on ideal places, attacking black, attacking this weakness, and now he wants to improve his king position. The king goes to b2 and then to b1. The thing is, the king was standing for too long without any motion, and therefore it's time to have some fitness. That's why he's moving back and forth, and now he's trying queen e1, rerouting the queen to b4, also putting pressure to this pawn, and finally after rook d8, white plays a4. Once again, the similar concept of a second weakness. Black made his best to cover up this weakness, and therefore he now wants to create one more. Moreover, in this case, Black simply resigned, because he can't even take it, he can't even trade pawns, because in this case queen b7 just wins the game because of this double attack. With that being said, I understand that all these ideas are nice, but very often we lose games simply because of a blunder. And if that sounds relatable, then I've got this video which showcases main rules that Fischer used to prevent blunders in his own games, and if you're curious, check this out.